We are coming up on the anniversary of Woodstock, coming up next month. But this past weekend, we were on our Facebook page. We spent a great deal of time talking about it, showing videos from YouTube. What we were doing was remembering July 13th, 1985, which was the date of Live Aid, which was a concert held in Wembley Stadium in the UK and JFK Stadium in Philadelphia to raise money for Ethiopian famine victims. It raised $127 million in 1985 money. A debate still is raised about how that money was used, but from a concert perspective, it was an amazing experience. The concert was 16 hours in length, simultaneously on two continents in the US and UK, and every major band that was anybody participated. The British Titans of Rock performed mostly on their own stage, although the Rolling Stones played on the American stage. But throughout the 16-hour affair, there were, from David Bowie, we just list a few of the names here. We started, the very first thing we showed was David Bowie, although the actual order I have no idea. Elton John by himself, Elton John, George Michael, when George Michael was with us, singing Don't Let the Sun Go Down on Me, the Beach Boys, Sting with Phil Collins, Sting with Dire Straits, Money for Nothing, and I'll mention something about Phil Collins a little bit later on, which was kind of mind-blowing even back then. Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers, Elvis Costello, The Cars, The Four Tops, U2, The Who, Zeppelin played, Queen. Of course, Queen was, that particular concert was considered to be their shining moment, and I believe was a large part of the movie Bohemian Rhapsody. I have not seen the movie, but you can see on YouTube a comparison to the actor who played Freddie and how they reenacted that performance. I personally saw Queen a couple times. I actually saw them more than a couple times, but I saw them twice when they were getting big, really big. Their Night at the Opera and Day at the Races album tour at the Forum in Los Angeles. And it was, to this day, I can't decide if it was my favorite concert or second favorite concert. The Welcome Back, My Friends, to the Show That Never Ends, ELP's 1974 World Tour, I think slightly gets the edge, but you could tell that Queen was something special on that tour, and they were going to be one of the great bands of all time. If you saw Freddie Mercury, and you know he was something special, and the whole band was great. Of course, Brian May is not talked about in as many circles as I think he should be as one of the great rock guitarists of all time. But the Brian May sound was integral to Queen and that hard rock sound that they delivered along with Roger Taylor and John Deacon. Awesome stuff. So anyway, Queen always gets the notoriety about Live Aid, and but there was lots of great music and different stuff too. To continue my list, Madonna played. Crosby, Stills, Nash, Neil Young played. Hall & Oates Duran Duran, a lot of 80s bands, and a lot of bands from England that weren't huge here in the States. But REO Speedwagon from the Midwest here in the States, they played. Bob Dylan played, and he played with Keith Richards and Ron Wood, too. So Ron Wood was already with the Stones back in 1985. Tina Turner and Mick Jagger performed together. Eric Clapton. So, it was huge. It was absolutely huge. And it ended with Paul McCartney singing Let It Be because they wanted an elder statesman to end the festivities, someone who could put a final note on it, and to have Sir Paul, he wasn't even Sir Paul then, perform was kind of the icing on the cake. But those are some of the highlights. What led up to this concert? I mean, we're talking about Woodstock. Woodstock was, I was 13 years old when Woodstock happened, not old enough to go. I don't think I would have gone. I've never really been a fan of outdoor concerts, but I'm in the minority there as they constantly fill these festival-type seatings. Festival-type seatings were rare back in the day. That's what they called it, which was standing room only. I like reserved seats, and I like to be able to sit down. If any of you boomers out there have been to concerts over the last 10 years, you might have noticed that you never get to sit down if you want to see. And that sucks. Ever since the day of mosh pits on rock concerts, I don't attend anymore because I'm not comfortable having to stand or deal with crazies. First time I ever saw something like that was years before, and once again, we'll talk about Queen. The last time I saw Queen was at a small concert venue. It would be like a 5,000 seat deal, and I was blown away. We had great seats, but it was, if you can believe it, too small a venue for their big arena sound. And Billy Squier opened for them, and I actually think he had a better set than Queen. And that's where we first saw the mosh pit kind of thing, people lunging on top of us. I was trying to protect my then girlfriend, now my wife, and my wife's best friend and her boyfriend was there, and we spent half the concert pushing these kids, and we're literally jumping behind us because there was an aisle behind us, just lunging like we were going to catch them or something. I was like, get the F out of here. It was crazy. I hated it, We went to the concerts back then to listen and watch the band, not to jump around and create mayhem, and definitely not to stand up the whole time. But I digress. Back to some of the background that Woodstock had already happened in 1969, and so now we're years later, and really the second British invasion, the progressive rock movement has pretty much come and gone. We've got Elton John and Springsteen coming up, who are the biggies now in the pop scene. And then the 80s bands and the 80s music. And then we moved into, the harder edge punk music back then. And but now we're in the middle of the 80s music with the pastel colors and the padded shoulders and the coiffed hair. No matter if it was a male or female band, it's funny to look at how band members dressed back in the 80s. In this particular concert, Duran Duran was there and other bands. I know Howard Jones was there. He played keyboard for Bowie's set. Bowie kind of just threw a band together of people that were there. If David Bowie walked around, the word got around that, hey, David Bowie needs some guys to play. Wouldn't you raise your hand? And they were great. He had singers, keyboard, drums, guitars, bass. I'd never heard of any of these guys. Howard Jones was the only guy I recognized. And he got quite a, introduction from Bowie as well, which was cool. Because he deserves it. I like Howard Jones. This whole thing started previous to that with, we had these Save the Children songs, Do They Know It's Christmas, where proceeds from that song and everybody who was anybody sang on that in one big room, including Boy George. And Boy George made some comment that he would like to take that idea and put it on a bigger scale. And of all people, Bob Geldof, and there's another person whose last name is Ure or something like that, Ure, who were really the driving forces behind what became Live Aid. So it kind of springboarded from Do They Know It's Christmas, the song that came out, I think it was 1984. Ethiopia, the famine had started on Michael Bjerk's on the BBC did a report on it, and that seemed to really grab the British attention, including Boy George. So it's springboarded from Boy George to Bob Geldof, who, because of his efforts to help the less fortunate or the dying, became in later years Sir Bob Geldof, to tip our cap to his efforts to... Of course, Bob Geldof, if you don't know, was in a group called the Boomtown Rats, which is kind of a weird title for a band. But their hit record was based on a true story of a teenage girl in San Diego, California, who got a gun out of the gun cabinet or wherever in the house she was living in and started shooting at kids going to school. And ended up spending her life in prison. And they asked her why she did it, and she said, "I don't like Mondays," was her reasoning. And so Bob Geldof heard about this and wrote a song called I Don't Like Mondays. I want to shoot the whole day down. It was a huge hit for them, and it was a great song. It's kind of like Aerosmith doing Jenny's Got a Gun. I think that's the name of it. Highlighting, a heinous, situation, abuse. In this case, I believe people were killed. School children were killed. Anyway, that's a little bit too much about Bob Geldof and a little backstory on that. But so it started with securing Wembley Stadium, and then due to some connections in the industry, some guy who actually created the instant replay machine had some connections in the States to some producers, and they started talking, and they secured JFK Stadium for the American end of the concert. And of course, a few big name acts come on. As a matter of fact, in the United States, Bill Graham, the famous rock promoter, producer, was in charge of the American show and introduced several of the acts. And a lot of celebrities, too. Jack Nicholson and others came on and introduced, I saw video clips of Jack Nicholson introducing Bob Dylan and others. So the whole thing snowballed, and they picked July 13th, 1985 to do the concert, and it was... Now they were getting better at the technology of satellite feeds where you could beam a live event via satellite and then watch it at home. Now, at the time, it was streamed live on MTV because, in the mid-'80s, MTV was it. And to some of us, MTV was not so good with rock and roll because it became all about the video. And truth be told, I think of all the videos I ever saw on MTV, there was probably 2 or 3 of them that I thought were ever any good. The rest of them were just a waste of time. But that was the changing face of music. We had the 80s sound, and we had the 80s look before we got into that punk scene, and music went off in yet another direction. And I personally could never get into punk. It was just, I like to joke, how come those nice looking young men are so angry? I mean, I grew up with the first British invasion, the second British invasion, which I call progressive rock. Those were my favoriteest bands. The bands that came up late 60s. The Beatles were finishing up their historic impact on the world, and the other groups just seemed to ride the next wave as the Beatles were done. And I'm talking about, yes, The Who, Emerson, Lake and Palmer, Genesis. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. King Crimson, you know, we all have our favorites. And that was to me the pinnacle of the rock era. And when that started to peak, probably in the late 70s, maybe into the early 80s, I could see an era had passed. And I was bummed about it. Imagine growing up through the 60s and 70s and seeing and hearing all this stuff for the first time. It was really something. You know, life changed completely when the Beatles came on radio and then the Ed Sullivan Show. Pop music became something a whole lot more important and affected our lives from that point on. So we had a good run from 64 on the Ed Sullivan Show all the way through the 70s. We're talking, 16 years of every single month, who's going to be in especially in the late 60s, into early 70s. A band came out with a record, you knew they were going to go on tour. And the tours got better and better and better. The sound got better and better and better. And just walking in the arena and going, whoa, looking at the setup, the way the stage was set up, and the lighting, and it was just really something. That was so great growing up in the 70s and going to see. It was not impossible to get tickets. You could get tickets. They may not be great tickets, but you could get tickets to get in, and they were affordable. It wasn't until music got completely corporated by the 80s that ticket prices, like today, to go to see a concert is, King's ransom practically. You have to really love your nostalgia to go back and participate in that. So, anyway, the concert, when it was said and done, was considered to be just another one of those major events. So many great bands played. You can review my Facebook page over the weekend of July 13th and 14th and look at video clips, or you can click on Live Aid 1985 on YouTube or Bing, and you can watch individual songs by all these artists. It gets kind of addictive. One interesting factoid, I mentioned Phil Collins sang, yes. He sang... Against All Odds, the hit from the movie. But he also played with other bands. Sting he played with, Eric Clapton, and he was the drummer for Led Zeppelin in their set at JFK. Zeppelin and the Stones actually played on the American stage. And Zeppelin, of course, didn't have a drummer because John Bonham had died in 1978. And before Jason Bonham came along, he wasn't old enough then. He was just a child, I'm sure. Phil Collins played drums. You can see Jimmy and John Paul Jones wasn't in the band either. It was just Plant and Page and Phil Collins, and I don't know who the guy was on bass. But I could see that just briefly watching the video when the camera moved around, because, of course, the camera stayed on Page and Plant most of the time. So Phil Collins was all over the place. And on the plane, the Concorde coming over, he saw Cher of Sonny and Cher fame. Everybody knows Cher. And Cher didn't know anything about the concert, so you can imagine when they reached the U.S., she attended the concert and actually got on stage to perform We Are the World. Amazing stuff. These little side stories, and I'm sure there's a million more. Any of you that went to the concert probably saw something that has not been written about on Wikipedia or anything else. So there were some glitches during the thing, of course, when the microphone on Paul McCartney's piano failed for the first 2 minutes of the song, which was a hassle. Matter of fact, years later, Paul went in and redubbed in the piano part for a later release. You can imagine something on that scale. They would have glitches. So anyway, that's it for this day in history. We're talking about July 13th, 1985, which was a historical day in rock, the day that was Live Aid 1985 for Ethiopian famine relief.